In 1957, Anastasia's killers put 10 bullets in the wrong man, Bumpy Johnson's driver, who'd saved his life twice. Anastasia offered $50,000. Bumpy refused. 45 days later, Anastasia died in a barber chair with 2 bullets in his skull. Who really gave the order? The morning Jerome Washington died. The air smelled like diesel and rotting fruit from the market carts on Lenox Avenue. He had the black Cadillac idling at 135th Street, engine purring low, when the Buick rolled up 2 car lengths behind. 3 men inside. No talk, just the kind of stillness that comes before bone breaks. The light turned red. Jerome's knuckles went white on the wheel. 15 years driving for Bumpy Johnson taught you to read a setup the way other men read newspapers. But this was Tuesday. Bumpy always took Brooklyn on Tuesdays. Jerome was just keeping the seat warm, maintaining the pattern so nobody got ideas about disrupted schedules. The 3 men stepped out while their engine was still running. They did not hurry. They did not check faces. They just walked to the driver's side door with their hands already inside their coats. The first bullet came through the window and jerked Jerome's shoulder back so hard his head cracked against the door frame. The second one punched through his ribs with a wet sound like a fist hitting a side of beef. The third came when the door was yanked open and the barrel was close enough that Jerome could see the carbon scoring on the steel. Then the rest came in a hammering sequence that turned the interior into a storm of torn leather and shattered glass. 10 shots. The brass casings hit the street and rolled into the gutter, making tiny pinging sounds under the thunder. The Cadillac shuddered on its suspension. Jerome slumped forward onto the horn. The noise cut through the morning like a factory whistle. One of the shooters reached in and shoved him back against the seat, leaving a handprint in the wet fabric. Then they walked back to the Buick and drove away at exactly 25 miles per hour. 40 seconds from the first shot to the turn onto 7th Avenue. The people on the sidewalk had already crossed to the other side of the street, moving with the practiced efficiency of citizens who understood that curiosity could get you a follow-up visit from men who did not appreciate witnesses. The police arrived 8 minutes later and pulled Jerome's wallet from his jacket. The detective read the driver's license out loud, then looked at his partner with the expression cops get when they know the next few days are going to involve conversations with people who do not talk to cops. Jerome Washington. Married. 3 kids. A driver. Not Ellsworth Raymond Johnson. Not Bumpy. Not the man half of Brooklyn wanted removed from the equation. Just a working man who happened to be sitting in the wrong seat on the wrong morning at the wrong intersection. The car was correct. The time was correct. The route matched what informants had been reporting for 3 months. But the face behind the wheel was not the face that needed erasing. People who examined the aftermath later remarked that the shooters had been given intelligence that was accurate up until the moment it was not. And nobody had thought to verify the variable that mattered most. They had trusted the system, confirmed the externals, executed the order. The fact that the wrong man's blood was soaking into the floorboards was a tactical error, not a moral one. Not yet. Jerome had never carried a gun for Bumpy, had never collected debts or enforced territory, or put his hands on anyone who needed correcting. His job was to drive and to notice things before they became problems. He spotted tails. He knew which streets flooded when it rained. He understood which cops could be driven past and which ones required a different route. He had saved Bumpy's life twice. Once in 1949 when he saw sunlight glinting off a rifle scope and floored it before the trigger got pulled. Once in 1953 when he drove through a vacant lot to avoid a panel truck full of men with shotguns. Bumpy had never thanked him with words. Just a nod. The kind of nod that meant you had earned your keep and your silence was worth more than most men's promises. Jerome existed in the margins. He was infrastructure. Reliable as plumbing. He went home every night to a row house in Sugar Hill, where his wife kept the floors clean and his daughters did their homework at the kitchen table. He did not drink heavy or chase women or spend money that would make people ask questions. When men like Jerome get killed by mistake, it means someone stopped caring about the difference between a target and a human being. It means corners got cut, details got ignored, and the organization that made the mistake just told everyone watching that maybe they were not as careful as they used to be. Power does not apologize for killing the right man, but when it kills the wrong one, everyone starts counting the days until the bill comes due. Drivers were supposed to be invisible. They existed in the gap between the men who gave orders and the men who followed them. They knew where the money moved and who met with who and which buildings had back exits that did not appear on any map the city kept. But they were not supposed to matter. They did not get a seat when territories were negotiated. They did not get a cut when shipments came through clean. They just drove and kept their mouths shut and went home when the work was finished. Jerome Washington had been doing this for 15 years, long enough that he stopped being just a driver and became something closer to a piece of Bumpy Johnson's operating system. He knew which routes avoided traffic at which hours. He knew which intersections had cops who looked the other way and which ones had cops who were building cases. He had been there when Bumpy was still fighting the Italians for control of the policy banks, when every corner in Harlem had 2 crews claiming it, and the only way to settle ownership was with bullets and trips to the hospital. Jerome had sat behind the wheel during all of it, engine idling, watching the mirrors, ready to move the second Bumpy came through a door. The first time he saved Bumpy's life was on Adam Clayton Powell Boulevard in 1949. A rifleman had set up in a third-floor window across from a bank where Bumpy collected weekly. Jerome saw the glint of the scope tracking their movement. He hit the gas before Bumpy's foot touched the pavement. The shot took out the rear window and sent glass all over the back seat. Bumpy went face down between the seats, shouting questions that did not get answered until they were 10 blocks away and Jerome's hands had stopped shaking. Then Bumpy started laughing, the kind of laugh that meant he knew how close the margin had been. The second time was near the Polo Grounds in 1953. A panel truck tried to box them in at an intersection. 2 men inside with shotguns, waiting for Jerome to slow down so they could pull alongside and open up. Jerome saw it coming. He yanked the wheel left, jumped the curb, and drove through a lot full of broken concrete and trash until they hit the next street over. Bumpy did not offer Jerome a raise or a promotion. He just nodded once. That nod was worth more than a speech. It meant Jerome had a place in the small circle of people Bumpy trusted to keep him breathing. And in that world, trust was currency you could not buy or fake. The men who worked close to Bumpy during those years later said Jerome's name almost never came up in internal discussions, which was strange for someone who had been around that long and proven himself under fire. Drivers usually got mentioned when they made mistakes, when they missed a tail or took a wrong turn or started talking to people who asked too many questions. The fact that Jerome went unmentioned meant he had done everything right for so long that he became part of the background. Dependable as sunrise. That invisibility kept him safe. Until the morning it made him a target because someone assumed the man in Bumpy's car had to be Bumpy. When Jerome died, it was not because anyone wanted him dead. It was because someone wanted Bumpy dead and did not bother checking who was actually behind the wheel. The shooters followed procedure. They verified the car, the route, the schedule. They did not verify the face. In their world, that was acceptable losses. You followed the intelligence. You executed the plan. If variables changed at the last second, that was not your fault. That was the fault of whoever provided the information. But mistakes like that have consequences that numbers and logic cannot account for. Bumpy got the news 2 hours later in a Brooklyn restaurant where he was negotiating with a supplier. Someone whispered in his ear. Bumpy's face stayed neutral. He finished the conversation, shook hands, walked out to a different car. Only when he was alone in the back seat, watching Brooklyn slide past the windows, did he let himself think about what it meant that Jerome was gone. What it meant that the men who killed him thought they could apologize with money. What it was going to cost them when they realized some debts do not get settled with cash. Anastasia found out about the mistake before the body was cold. Word moved fast in 1957, when you killed the wrong man on a Harlem street, where half the witnesses had cousins who worked in clubs and bars, where information was more valuable than liquor. By noon, Anastasia was sitting in a Brooklyn office trying to calculate whether this was fixable or whether he needed to start preparing for a war. Anastasia did not apologize as a general rule. His reputation was built on the understanding that when he decided you were finished, you were finished. And there was no negotiation. But he also understood the economics of organized crime. You could kill a competitor, and people would respect the efficiency. You could kill a traitor, and nobody would question it. But killing a loyal employee by accident, a man who had never been involved in disputes or power plays, a man who just drove a car and kept his head down for 15 years, that was sloppy. That was the kind of mistake that made people wonder if you were still sharp, or if age and comfort had made you careless. So he sent an emissary, not one of the shooters, not an enforcer. He sent a lawyer in a pressed suit who had never fired a weapon but knew how to deliver a message without it sounding like a threat or an insult. The lawyer showed up at a social club on 116th Street in the late afternoon. He asked if Mr. Johnson had time for a brief conversation. Bumpy waved him into a back room that smelled like tobacco and furniture oil. The lawyer sat down and placed a manila envelope on the table. He did not open it. He just said that Mr. Anastasia wanted to express regret about the incident involving Mr. Washington, that it had been a misidentification, that compensation was being offered as a gesture of respect and responsibility. Bumpy looked at the envelope without touching it. $50,000. Enough to bury Jerome properly. Enough to keep his wife and children comfortable for years. Enough to show that Anastasia took the error seriously and wanted to close the matter like professionals. The lawyer waited. He had been briefed that Bumpy might negotiate for more or try to leverage the situation into concessions on territory. What he had not been prepared for was the silence that stretched out until it became uncomfortable. Bumpy leaned back in his chair. He looked at the envelope like it was something diseased. Then he said, "Take it back." The lawyer started to explain that Mr. Anastasia had gone to considerable effort to arrange this, that it was meant to demonstrate goodwill, that situations like this could escalate if not handled properly. Bumpy interrupted. Jerome Washington was not for sale when he was alive. He is not for sale now. Tell your boss we are finished talking. The lawyer picked up the envelope with hands that stayed steady, even though his face had gone the color of old paper. Men who were present for similar negotiations over the years later remarked that the silence in that room carried more weight than any shouting match or threat they had witnessed. No raised voices, no demands for retribution, just a refusal that landed like a physical blow. When the lawyer reported back, Anastasia understood immediately that money was not going to resolve this. Money worked for business disputes. Money worked when everyone agreed the violence had been justified and just needed accounting. Money did not work when the killing had been careless and broke the unwritten rules about who was protected and why. Bumpy's refusal meant he was not interested in compensation. He was interested in something that could not be purchased or negotiated. Something that required patience and planning and a willingness to let situations develop without forcing them. For the first time in years, Anastasia felt the floor shift under him. Not panic, just the recognition that he had created a problem that would not disappear because he willed it to. and the man on the other side was not going to give him the clean war. He knew how to win. Illinois Gordon came through the door of the social club on 116th Street with his shirt soaked through, despite the October cold that made your fingers ache when you lit a cigarette outside. He had spent 3 days listening to men in Brooklyn talk about how many body bags they were going to need when Bumpy Johnson finally made his move. The air in the club smelled like old smoke and coffee that had been burning on the hot plate since morning. Gordon dropped into the chair across from Bumpy without asking permission. His hands were shaking just enough that you noticed if you were looking for it. He leaned forward with his elbows on the table and his voice came out tight like a man trying not to shout in church. Anastasia has 20 shooters rotating through Harlem right now, Gordon said. They are watching every building you own, every club you walk into, every street corner where you might show your face. They have shotguns and Tommy guns and instructions to open fire the second you give them a reason. Bumpy sat there with his hands flat on the scarred wood. His face showed nothing. No anger. No fear. Just the expression of a man who had already done all his thinking and arrived at a conclusion that nobody else had figured out yet. Murder Incorporated does not lose gunfights, Gordon continued. They have been doing this since you were still running numbers out of a grocery store. You go to war with them and Harlem is going to run out of coffins before Brooklyn runs out of bullets. Bumpy reached for his coffee cup. The liquid inside had gone cold hours ago and had that greasy film on top that happens when coffee sits too long in a room that smells like failure and cigarette ash. He took a sip anyway, set the cup down without making a sound. I am not going to war with Albert Anastasia, Bumpy said. The words came out flat and certain, like he was reading off a train schedule that could not be changed no matter who complained about it. Gordon's face went through 3 different expressions in the space of 2 seconds. Confusion hit first, then something close to relief, then suspicion that maybe he had missed something important enough to get him killed. Then what the hell are you planning? Gordon asked. His voice carried an edge now, sharp enough to cut through the noise from the card game in the front room. Jerome is 6 feet under with dirt in his mouth. You sent $50,000 back to Brooklyn like it was toilet paper. Anastasia knows you are not letting this go. If you do not hit him first, he is going to think you are weak, and weak men do not live long enough to explain why they decided to be reasonable. Bumpy picked up the cup again, even though the coffee tasted like pennies. He took another sip. Put it down. Looked at Gordon like a teacher watching a student struggle with mathematics that should have been simple. I am not hitting Anastasia because I do not need to hit him, Bumpy said. You want to know what happens if I go to war with Murder Incorporated? I will tell you exactly what happens. We trade bodies for 3 weeks. I lose 15 men. He loses 10. Maybe I get lucky and one of my shooters gets close enough to put a bullet in Albert himself. You know what happens after that. Gordon waited. Bumpy leaned back in his chair until the wood creaked under the shift in weight. After that, I spend 5 years rebuilding what I could have kept intact. Bumpy said, I lose territory while I am burying soldiers. I lose money while the cops are crawling all over Harlem asking questions. And even if I win, even if Anastasia ends up in the morgue with his face blown off, I am still weaker than I was before the shooting started. That is not victory. That is just expensive dying. Gordon nodded slowly. The logic made sense the way most things made sense when Bumpy explained them. But logic did not account for the fact that doing nothing looked like weakness, and weakness in their business was a death sentence that just took longer to execute. So you are walking away? Gordon asked. You are going to let them kill Jerome and pretend it never happened, because that is what it looks like from where I am sitting. The question hung in the air between them like smoke from a gun that had already been fired. Then Bumpy smiled. Not the kind of smile that meant something was funny. The kind that meant he knew the punchline and everyone else was still waiting for the setup to make sense. "I am not walking away from anything," Bumpy said. "I am just not doing what Anastasia expects me to do. Right now he is sitting in Brooklyn waiting for me to send shooters. He has men on every corner with their hands on their weapons. He has drivers ready to block streets. He has doctors on call to patch up whoever survives the first exchange. What he does not have is a plan for what happens when nothing happens." Gordon leaned back. His chair made a sound like it was going to split apart. He had been in enough backroom strategy sessions to recognize when someone had thought further ahead than the obvious move. But thinking ahead only mattered if the plan actually worked. "What are you doing if you are not going to war?" Gordon asked. Bumpy stood up. The conversation was finished whether Gordon had more questions or not. "I am going to let Albert Anastasia destroy himself," Bumpy said. "I am going to make sure every ambitious soldier in his crew starts asking whether the boss is still sharp enough to lead. I am going to feed information to the greedy ones and paranoia to the careful ones. And when he finally goes down, it is going to be his own people who pull the trigger. Not mine. Not anyone from Harlem. His own crew is going to decide he is a liability, and they are going to handle it the way these things get handled." Men who investigated the communications between Harlem and Brooklyn during this period later testified in closed sessions that they could not find a single direct order from Bumpy Johnson, which they noted was unusual given how closely they had been monitoring the networks at that time. Gordon sat there trying to process what he had just heard. It was brilliant if it worked. It was also the kind of strategy that required patience most men in their business had never been taught to have. You had to trust that people would act on their worst instincts without needing permission or encouragement. "And if it does not work?" Gordon asked. "If Anastasia figures out what you are doing before his people turn on him?" Bumpy was already at the door. He looked back with that same calm expression that made men follow him, even when the odds looked impossible. "Then I will have bought myself time to prepare for the war I am trying to avoid," Bumpy said. "But it will work, because the most dangerous thing in our world is not an enemy with guns. It is a boss who gives his own crew reasons to stop trusting him. And Anastasia just gave every man under him a very good reason to start asking questions about whether he still knows what he is doing. Real power is not about forcing men to follow orders. Real power is about creating situations where what you want to happen happens on its own, without your name attached to it." Bumpy spent the next week doing what looked like nothing to anyone who was not paying close attention. He sat in his usual spots. He talked to his usual people. He collected from the policy banks and settled disputes about territory and percentages. From the outside, it looked like business as usual. A man going through his routine while he decided what to do about a problem everyone knew was coming. But inside his head, Bumpy was building something that would not show up on any map the police kept. He was constructing a blueprint of Albert Anastasia's empire. Not the parts you could see, the parts underneath, the pressure points, the cracks in the foundation, the men who were loyal until they had a reason not to be. Killing Anastasia directly was simple. You found out where he went for his morning shave. You put 2 shooters in barber coats with revolvers under the towels. You waited until he was in the chair with hot foam on his face and his eyes closed. Then you fired until the chair stopped rocking and the floor was slick enough that the barbers had trouble standing up when they tried to run. But simple got you killed by the next man in line who wanted to prove his loyalty to the dead boss's memory. What Bumpy needed was not Anastasia dead. What he needed was Anastasia removed by his own organization, so that when it was over, nobody in Brooklyn would be looking at Harlem for revenge because they would be too busy fighting each other for control. He started with the deportation cases. 2 of Anastasia's top lieutenants had been fighting extradition to Italy for 3 years. The evidence was solid. Witnesses had given statements. The Italian government wanted them back. The only reason these men were still walking around Mulberry Street instead of sitting in Roman prison cells was because Anastasia had connections. Lawyers who knew how to delay hearings. Judges who understood that certain verdicts came with envelopes full of cash. But those delays cost money. Serious money. More than most soldiers realized. Bumpy made sure the right people started hearing exactly how much Anastasia was spending to keep 2 men out of Italian custody. Men who were not earning anymore. Men who had become liabilities instead of assets. Men who would probably give up names if they ever did get shipped overseas and face 30 years in a cell. The conversation started quiet. A bookkeeper mentioned to his cousin that the legal fees seemed high. An accountant told his wife, who told her brother, who worked in a restaurant where Gambino's people ate lunch. Within 2 weeks, half of Brooklyn knew that Anastasia was burning through thousands of dollars a month to protect 2 soldiers who could not even operate anymore because the heat on them was too intense. Then there was Carlo Gambino, Anastasia's underboss, a man who had been waiting for years with the patience of a hunter in a blind. Never pushing. Never complaining. Just doing his job and watching for the moment when ambition could look like duty instead of betrayal. Gambino had his own crew, his own network, his own ideas about how things should be run. Bumpy had never met Gambino face to face, but he knew people who knew people. In their world, information moved through channels that did not require handshakes or signed documents. What Gambino needed was not permission to move against Anastasia. What he needed was certainty that if he made his play, Harlem would not open a second front that would force him to fight a war on 2 sides. Bumpy provided that certainty without ever saying it directly. He let intermediaries know that Harlem had no interest in Brooklyn's internal politics, that whoever ended up running Murder Incorporated next would start with a clean relationship as long as they understood that mistakes like Jerome Washington were not going to be tolerated a second time. The federal pressure was already there. Anastasia had been too loud for too long. He gave interviews. He lived in a mansion that made tax investigators ask questions about where a man with no legitimate income got money for swimming pools and Italian marble. The IRS had been building a case for 2 years. The same kind of case that put Al Capone in Alcatraz and left him there until syphilis ate through his brain. Bumpy made sure the people around Anastasia knew about the investigation before Anastasia did. He made sure they understood that when the indictments came down, they were going to be comprehensive. That anyone standing too close was going to get pulled into the machinery whether they deserved it or not. Then there was Cuba. Anastasia had money in Havana casinos, partnerships with Meyer Lansky, cash flowing through Caribbean banks that existed in the gray areas between American law and island corruption. But Cuba was unstable. There were revolutionaries in the mountains, politicians who might decide next year that nationalizing foreign assets was good politics. Bumpy made sure the men who had their own money in those same ventures started hearing worries about exposure, about how much Anastasia had leveraged, about how bad it would hurt if Castro came to power and decided that American gangsters made excellent enemies of the people. Intelligence officers who later tried to reconstruct the flow of information during this period found that the connections only became clear when multiple unrelated sources were compared side by side, suggesting either remarkable coincidence or a strategy so subtle it left no evidence of central coordination. By the end of 2 weeks, Anastasia was not isolated. He still had soldiers. He still had operations making money. But the men around him were asking questions they had not asked before. Questions about whether the boss was still sharp, whether his spending made sense, whether the protection he provided was worth the exposure he created. And once those questions started, they did not stop. They multiplied. They spread. They turned loyalty into something that needed constant justification instead of being assumed. Nobody gets removed from power because their enemies want them gone. They get removed because their friends decide keeping them around costs more than letting them fall. Rumors were worthless in their world unless they came with something concrete attached to them. Everyone had stories about who was skimming and who was talking to the feds and who was sleeping with whose wife while the husband was out collecting debts. Most of it was entertainment. Noise to fill the hours men spent sitting in social clubs with nothing to do but drink coffee and complain. What Bumpy needed was not rumor. What he needed was information that felt like discovery. The kind of thing that made men think they had figured it out themselves, instead of having it handed to them by someone with an agenda. He started with Anastasia's money. The boss had bank accounts in 3 states. Real estate in New Jersey bought through shell companies with names that sounded like legitimate businesses but were just words on paper. Investments in operations that existed primarily to turn dirty money into clean deposits that could be spent without attracting attention. Most of this was known to the people who needed to know it, but the details were kept deliberately vague. Numbers were estimated instead of stated. Ownership was buried under layers of incorporation paperwork that required lawyers and accountants to untangle. As long as money kept flowing, nobody asked too many questions about where it came from or where it went. Bumpy did not have access to bank statements or ledgers. What he had was 20 years of watching how money moved and listening to conversations men thought were private. He had bartenders who heard things, drivers who talked to other drivers while they waited outside restaurants, women who cleaned offices at night and noticed folders on desks with numbers that did not match what the businesses supposedly generated. From those fragments, he built a picture. Then he made sure pieces of that picture ended up where Carlo Gambino's people would find them. A bookkeeper mentioned to his cousin that revenue numbers on a Newark property did not line up with what the building actually produced. A lawyer let slip over drinks that one of Anastasia's holding companies showed income from a business that had been shuttered for 6 months. None of it was proof that would hold up in court or even in a sit-down where accusations required evidence. But it was enough to make people start looking closer. Enough to make accountants pull files they had been filing away without reading. Enough to make soldiers who were not seeing the payouts they expected start wondering if the money was going somewhere other than where they had been told. Then Bumpy made sure people started noticing how Anastasia spent. The mansion in Fort Lee with grounds that required a gardener and a maintenance crew. The cars. The suits that cost more than most men earned in 3 months. The trips to Havana where he stayed in hotel suites with ocean views and ran up tabs that would have covered a soldier's salary for a year. None of this was secret. Anastasia did not hide his wealth. He displayed it. But when you laid it next to the operations that were supposed to be making everyone rich, the mathematics started looking wrong. Soldiers who had been loyal for a decade began having quiet conversations over coffee that lasted too long and ended with expressions that looked like men doing arithmetic in their heads and not liking the totals. Why was the boss living like a Rockefeller while they were getting squeezed by legal fees and federal attention? Why were profits getting split thinner while Anastasia's personal spending kept climbing? Why did the organization keep taking risks that benefited him more than the men who actually took those risks? The beauty of Bumpy's approach was that he was not inventing problems. He was not planting false information or creating scandals out of nothing. He was just making sure the problems that already existed got noticed by men who had been too loyal or too busy to pay attention before. He was turning whispers into conversations, and conversations into concerns that grew heavier every time they got spoken out loud. Anastasia started feeling it in small ways that accumulated like pressure building behind a dam. A lieutenant who used to return calls within an hour now took a full day to respond. A partner who used to agree with decisions now wanted to see numbers and projections. A soldier who used to handle problems without being asked now waited for explicit instructions before moving. Trust is not something you establish once and forget about. It requires maintenance, constant reinforcement through consistency and results. When the consistency breaks and the results start looking questionable, trust does not just weaken, it fractures, And once it fractures, every new problem makes the crack wider until the whole foundation is compromised. Federal agents who reviewed the intelligence reports years later noted in internal communications that they could not identify a single source for the leaked financial information, which suggested either extraordinary operational security or the possibility that multiple independent actors had arrived at similar conclusions without coordination. By mid-October, Anastasia was spending more energy managing his own organization than running operations. He was questioning men who had been with him since the beginning. He was demanding loyalty oaths from soldiers who had already proven their commitment with scars and prison sentences. He was seeing conspiracies in routine conversations and betrayal in normal business discussions. And the more paranoid he became, the more his crew started thinking maybe the concerns were justified. Maybe the boss really was losing his edge. Maybe the man who built Murder Incorporated into the most feared organization in 5 states was no longer capable of running it effectively. Maybe it was time for new leadership before the whole structure collapsed and buried everyone under the rubble. Bumpy watched from Harlem without celebration or commentary. He did not make calls. He did not send messages. He just waited. Because the final move was not his to make. It had to come from inside Anastasia's organization, from men who decided that their survival required his removal. When suspicion replaces trust in a structure built on absolute loyalty, the decay happens fast. Men who used to be your protection start looking for exits, and exits in their world usually required removing the obstacle that stood between them and safety. Carlo Gambino was not a man who moved without thinking 3 steps ahead. He had survived 20 years in Murder Incorporated by being the one who listened when other men talked, who waited when other men rushed, who understood that the second most powerful position often came with a longer lifespan than the first. But by the last week of October, 1957, waiting had become more dangerous than acting. Albert Anastasia was hemorrhaging credibility. The federal investigations were tightening like a noose. The spending was attracting attention that no amount of lawyer fees could deflect. The paranoia had turned routine conversations into interrogations. Every day Anastasia remained in power was another day the entire organization slid closer to either indictment or implosion. What Gambino needed was not permission exactly. What he needed was certainty that removing Anastasia would not trigger retaliation from the other families or from Harlem, where Bumpy Johnson had every reason to see Brooklyn chaos as an opportunity to expand into territory that did not belong to him. Gambino needed a window where he could act without starting a war that would consume everything he was trying to preserve. The message came through channels so deliberately indirect that tracing it back to a source would have required interrogating a dozen men who would all claim they were just passing along something they heard. A union lawyer who had drinks with a Harlem numbers runner who reported to someone in Bumpy's inner circle. The content was simple enough that it could not be misunderstood. Harlem had no interest in Brooklyn's internal difficulties. Whatever happened inside Murder Incorporated would stay inside Murder Incorporated as long as the new management understood that certain types of mistakes would not be tolerated going forward. Gambino received this information while eating veal at a restaurant in Little Italy, where the owner knew to seat him at a corner table where the acoustics made eavesdropping impossible, even if someone was trying. The man delivering the message was careful never to say where it originated or who exactly had authorized it. He just laid out the facts like he was discussing the weather, and then waited for Gambino to process what he was hearing. When the explanation finished, Gambino set down his fork and wiped his mouth with a cloth napkin that was heavier than most men's shirts. He did not smile. He did not nod. He sat there for a long moment, letting the implications settle into place like puzzle pieces that suddenly revealed a picture he had been trying to see for weeks. You are telling me that if we handle this situation internally, there will be no complications from outside parties who might view the transition as an opportunity to renegotiate existing arrangements. Gambino asked. His voice was low enough that the waiter pouring water 3 tables away could not have heard a syllable, even if he had been listening. The messenger nodded once. "I am telling you what I was told," he said. "The people in Harlem who make decisions have made it clear they consider this a Brooklyn problem that requires a Brooklyn solution. They are not interested in involvement. They are not interested in expansion. They just want assurance that the kind of operational failure that occurred with their driver does not happen again under new leadership." Gambino picked up his wine glass. The liquid inside was so dark it looked black in the candlelight and smelled like fruit that had been left to ferment until the sugar turned aggressive. He took a small sip, set the glass down with enough care that it did not make a sound against the tablecloth. "Then we understand each other," Gambino said. "Albert has become a liability that affects everyone's operations. His behavior attracts federal attention. His spending creates exposure. His judgment raises questions about whether he can still protect the organization instead of endangering it. If that liability were to be removed internally, in a manner that restored stability and confidence, I am hearing there would be no outside interference that would complicate the transition." The messenger did not confirm or deny. He just finished his meal and left enough cash on the table to cover both dinners, plus a tip that was twice what the food cost. Within 18 hours, the message had traveled back through the same indirect channels to Harlem. Bumpy heard about it while sitting in his club listening to a piano player who could make the keys sound like they were crying. He did not react visibly, just a single nod to indicate he had received and understood the information. He had not issued orders. He had not made promises or commitments. He had simply created conditions where other men could act on instincts they already possessed, without fear of consequences they could not control. People who were present in the rooms where critical decisions were made during this period later testified that no formal minutes were kept and no recordings existed, which was standard procedure for conversations that could result in conspiracy charges if documentary evidence ever surfaced in federal court. Anastasia had been reclassified, not as an enemy to be fought, as an internal problem to be resolved, and internal problems in their world did not get solved through negotiation or graceful retirement. They got solved through the understanding that some men had become more valuable gone than present, and removing them was not murder if everyone with a stake in the outcome agreed it was necessary structural maintenance. A man who gets labeled as a problem does not need to be actively killed. He just needs to be allowed to disappear in a way that looks like natural consequences, catching up to poor decisions he made himself. Gambino now had everything he required. Not an order, not a partnership. Just the absence of obstacles. Just the knowledge that when Anastasia went down, the aftermath would not include complications from Harlem that would turn a leadership transition into a multi-front war nobody could win. Albert Anastasia followed routines the way other men followed religion. Every weekday morning except Sunday, he walked into the Park Sheraton Hotel barbershop on 7th Avenue at exactly 10:15. He sat in chair number 4. He got a shave and a trim from the same barber who had been cutting his hair for 8 years, and knew without asking how he wanted his sideburns shaped and never made conversation, unless Anastasia initiated it first. The routine was predictable enough that anyone paying attention could have set a stopwatch by it. But predictability had never concerned him, because who would be reckless enough to hit someone like Albert Anastasia in a public barbershop in Midtown Manhattan in broad daylight on a Friday morning, when the hotel lobby upstairs was full of businessmen and tourists? October 25, 1957 started like it always started. Anastasia's driver let him out at the hotel entrance at 10:13. He walked through the lobby past the front desk where a clerk was helping a couple from Pennsylvania find their room keys. He took the stairs down to the basement level where the barbershop occupied a space that smelled like talcum powder and bay rum and had black and white tile floors that showed every scuff mark from the morning's customers. The barber saw him come through the door and gestured toward chair 4, which had just been vacated by a traveling salesman who had spent 20 minutes complaining about traffic. Anastasia settled into the leather seat. The barber wrapped the cloth around his neck with practiced efficiency and pumped the chair up to working height. Then came the hot towels, pressed against Anastasia's face until the heat opened his pores and made the skin ready for the straight razor. Anastasia let his eyes close. This was the only part of his day when he allowed himself to relax completely. When the barbershop door opened behind him, he did not turn to look. When he heard footsteps approaching, he assumed it was another customer heading toward one of the empty chairs. The first indication something was wrong came when the barber made a small choking sound and stepped backward fast enough that his shoes squeaked on the wet tile. Anastasia opened his eyes and tried to sit up, but the hot towels were still covering his face, and the chair was reclined at an angle that made getting leverage difficult. He got his hands up to pull the cloth away, and that was when the first shot tore through his right hand, removing most of his pinky finger and spraying tissue across the white towels in a pattern that looked like someone had flicked a paintbrush loaded with dark red. The second shot hit his left wrist and shattered the bone with a crack you could hear over the radio playing in the corner. He tried to push himself out of the chair, but his legs would not cooperate, and his hands were not working right anymore. The third shot caught him in the back of the head from close enough that the muzzle flash singed the hair above his ear. His skull came apart. Fragments of bone scattered across the headrest and onto the floor where they mixed with hair clippings from earlier customers. The fourth and fifth shots hit him while he was already falling forward. His body jerked with each impact. The towels fell into his lap along with pieces of himself that were small enough you might mistake them for soap chips if you were not looking closely, and did not notice the pink and gray mixed into the white. Two men in dark overcoats stood behind the chair with revolvers that were still smoking. They had walked in through the front entrance like regular customers. They had positioned themselves during the 30 seconds when the barber was applying the hot towels and Anastasia's eyes were covered. They had waited until his hands were occupied trying to get comfortable. Then they had fired 10 rounds in the time it takes to count to 12. The barber was already gone, running toward the back exit so fast he left his scissors on the counter. The 3 other customers were either flat on the floor or stumbling toward the door in that awkward half-run people do when they are trying to escape. But their legs will not quite obey because their brain is still processing what their eyes just witnessed. The 2 shooters walked out the same door they had entered through. They did not run. They did not look back at the mess they had created. They just climbed the stairs to the lobby where tourists were asking the concierge for directions to Times Square, and businessmen were checking out with their briefcases and their receipts. Outside, a car was idling at the curb with a driver who knew 4 different routes to 4 different safe houses and had been told which one to use depending on how the traffic looked. Anastasia died in chair 4 with his face pressed into towels that had gone from white to the color of rust. The barber's comb was still sitting in the blue disinfectant solution. The radio was still playing music. The clock on the wall said 10:23. 8 minutes from the time he walked in until the time his heart stopped pushing what was left of his blood through the holes in his skull. Police arrived 16 minutes later. They found the body still warm and the surviving barbers huddled in the corner, looking like men who knew they were going to see this scene every time they closed their eyes for the rest of their lives. Detectives who processed the scene noted in their official reports that the execution had been professional and thorough. But what struck them as unusual was that none of their regular informants had picked up any advance warning about a contract on Anastasia, which suggested either extraordinary security or the possibility that the decision had been made and executed so rapidly that rumors had not had time to circulate through normal channels. Nobody in the official investigation mentioned what had happened 45 days earlier on a Harlem corner. Nobody drew connections between Jerome Washington bleeding out behind a steering wheel and Albert Anastasia bleeding out in a barber chair. The detectives focused on Brooklyn, on internal power struggles, on money and territory and ambition. The man who pulls the trigger is not always the man who decided the outcome. Sometimes the real decision gets made weeks earlier in quiet rooms, where the only evidence is what gets deliberately forgotten. 4 days after they buried Albert Anastasia in a cemetery plot that cost more than most men earned in 5 years, Bumpy Johnson walked up the front steps of a row house in Sugar Hill. It was early evening, the kind of November twilight where the air carried the smell of coal smoke from furnaces being fired up for the first time since spring, and the cold had teeth that bit through your coat if you stood still too long. Bumpy was not wearing his usual tailored suit, just simple slacks and a plain overcoat that would not draw attention from anyone who happened to be watching the street. He knocked on the door twice. Clara Washington answered after a moment. She looked thinner than she had 6 weeks ago. Her eyes had the hollowed-out quality of someone who had cried so much that tears had become mechanical instead of cathartic. She recognized him immediately. Her hand went to her throat like she was trying to physically hold words in that might escape otherwise. "Mr. Johnson," she said. Her voice came out smaller than she probably wanted it to. "I was not expecting anyone this evening." She started to say something else, but Bumpy raised one hand gently to stop her. "I am not here to cause you trouble, Mrs. Washington," Bumpy said. "I am here because Jerome was a good man who deserved better than what happened to him. I am here to make sure you and your children are provided for properly. May I come in for just a moment so we can speak privately?" Clara stepped back and opened the door wider. Bumpy walked into the front room. The house smelled like cooking grease and furniture polish and the particular staleness that settles into a place where someone is grieving hard enough that opening windows feels like too much effort. There were photographs on the mantel. Jerome in his army uniform from before the war. The 3 children at different stages of growing up. A wedding picture where both Jerome and Clara looked impossibly young and optimistic about futures that had not yet taught them how quickly happiness could be taken away. Bumpy reached inside his coat and pulled out an envelope. Not the same envelope Anastasia's lawyer had brought to the social club 6 weeks earlier. A different one. Thicker. He set it on the small table near the door with enough care that it did not make a sound. "This is not official," Bumpy said. "This is not part of any arrangement or agreement between organizations. This is from people in the neighborhood who knew Jerome and understood what he meant to this community. There is enough money in that envelope to pay off your mortgage and make sure your children can finish their education without you having to worry about where the next dollar is coming from." Clara looked at the envelope like it might explode if she touched it. "Mr. Johnson, I cannot accept this," she said. "People will talk. They will say I took money from you, and that will mean things I do not want it to mean about Jerome or about me, or about what kind of arrangement we had." Bumpy shook his head slowly. "Nobody is going to say anything because nobody is going to know about this unless you decide to tell them," he said. "This is not a transaction, Mrs. Washington. This is not payment for services rendered or for silence or for anything else that would require you to owe anyone a debt. This is just making certain that Jerome's family does not suffer, because he was loyal to people who should have kept him safer than they did." He turned toward the door, but Clara's voice stopped him. It was steadier now, stronger than it had been when she first opened the door. "Did you do it?" she asked. "Did you do what everyone on this street is saying you did?" Bumpy stopped with his hand already on the doorknob. He did not turn around to face her. "I do not know what people are saying, Mrs. Washington," he said. "All I know is that Jerome was a good man who got killed because someone made a terrible mistake in judgment. And I know that mistakes like that have consequences even when those consequences take time to arrive. Your husband is gone and nothing in this world is going to bring him back. But the people who were responsible for what happened to him will not be making that same mistake with anyone else's family." That is all I can tell you about this situation." He walked out into the November evening without waiting for her to respond. Clara stood in the doorway holding the envelope in both hands like it weighed more than it actually did. She did not open it until after she had put all 3 children to bed and the house was quiet enough to hear the radiator ticking as it cooled. Inside was more cash than Jerome had earned in 4 years of driving. There was no note, no signature, no documentation of where it came from, except that she knew exactly where it came from, and she understood instinctively that asking questions about it would be dangerous for everyone involved. In the weeks that followed, nobody in the neighborhood mentioned Bumpy's visit to anyone outside Clara's immediate family. She paid off the mortgage 3 months early. She enrolled her oldest daughter in a private academy that had previously been financially impossible. She bought winter coats for all 3 children that were new instead of handed down. When neighbors asked where the money came from, she just said Jerome had been better at saving than anyone realized, and left it at that. They did not push for details because in Harlem in 1957, you learned early that some questions led to answers that could get you hurt. The story only survived because Clara told her children years later, when they were old enough to understand what loyalty meant in a world where most promises evaporated the moment they became inconvenient. She told them their father had been valued by people who mattered, and that his death had been answered even if that answer never got discussed in public or acknowledged in any official way. Stories like this only continue to exist because someone chose to remember them when forgetting would have been easier and safer. In their world, loyalty is not protected by guns or public displays of violence or threats shouted loud enough for everyone to hear. It is protected by the quiet understanding that breaking it carries consequences that will find you eventually, even if those consequences take 45 days to materialize and arrive from directions you never anticipated. It is protected by making sure that anyone who considers making the same mistake remembers what happened the last time someone killed the wrong man and assumed money could settle the debt. The old order ended in a barber chair with bone fragments scattered across tile and hot towels soaked through with fluids that used to be inside a human skull. The new order began in silence, in conversations that left no recordings, in decisions that happened without anyone needing to give explicit authorization. Not because of superior firepower or willingness to escalate violence, but because of patience, because of understanding that real power is not about forcing outcomes through direct action, but about creating conditions where outcomes manifest on their own without your fingerprints anywhere near them. This story never appeared in any newspaper. Not because it didn't happen, but because there are truths that make powerful men ensure the ink never dries. The kind of history that gets locked in federal archives marked sealed until everyone involved is dead, and the only witnesses left are the ones who learn to forget. If you want to keep hearing the stories they buried, the power moves they never reported, and the decisions that shaped American underworld from inside rooms where official history refuses to look, hit that subscribe button. We're not here for entertainment. We're here to show you how real power operates when there's no record being kept, when there's no law standing between ambition and consequence, when the only rule that matters is who's still breathing when the smoke clears.